It's really a gift for us to have such an amazing group of people who have become part of our community today. So it seems appropriate that this is the Sunday that was chosen last May to look back at some of the free thinkers who paved the way for Unitarian thought to emerge in spite of a religious persecution. Challenges to freedom of religious thought in our nation today make us more aware of the dedication that our forebears had to have to hold their religious beliefs. And sadly, essentially almost every one of the people we'll be talking about today was either burned at the stake or imprisoned. Historically, Unitarian Universalists have honored those who claimed Unitarian thought, whether officially within our faith or those whose beliefs mirrored our own. One such person was Catherine Vogel, who lived from about 1460 to 1539. Her name was anglicized first from Polish to German, so Katarzyna Wiglowa became Catherine Vogel, which is easier for my English-speaking mouth to pronounce. She was born Roman Catholic in Poland, but converted because of her reading of the scripture to Judaism or Judaizing non-Trinitarianism. There was some movement there in terms of thought. So she renounced the dogma of the Roman Catholic Church, and that was a really dangerous act. And at age 70, she was arrested for professing the unity of God and rejecting the notion of the Holy Trinity. At age 80, she was burned at the stake, still loudly professing her belief in the unity of God. Today, both Jews and Unitarian Universalists regard her as a martyr. What was surprising about her death was that in 16th century Poland, the Polish people had one of the highest degrees of religious tolerance in that time. Her belief spoke to the inability of religious oppression to suppress free thought of those who chose to believe according to their own conscience, even if it cost them their lives. One of the forebears I like to claim as our ancestor was actually a Roman Catholic priest. We'll claim anybody. Jan Hus lived from 1372 to 1450, and he was educated and then was a professor at the University of Prague. In 1402, Hus became pastor of the Bethlehem Chapel. It became one of the centers of the Bohemian Reform movement. And reform movements were sought because of the greed and power seeking that people saw in the Roman Catholic Church. So Bethlehem actually means house of bread. And it was the Bethlehem Chapel that Hus meant to be a place that would offer people bread to nourish the heart and the mind. He broke with orthodoxy and preached not in Latin, but in the common language of the people. We need to remember that in his day, most people were illiterate and certainly didn't understand Latin. So this would have been the first time that people in his congregation would have been able to understand what he was saying. Hus's sermons were so popular that people would climb up into the rafters to be able to hear what he was saying. People were jammed in. So his being able to speak in the common language was incredible, but that wasn't radical enough thinking for Hus. He also served both the bread and the wine at communion. And because of these radical acts, he is named as one of the people who helped bring about the Protestant Revolution. So in his day, the common people weren't allowed to drink the wine at communion for several reasons. One was the church thought that common people might contaminate the communion wine because, their beards, the men's beards might fall into the communion wine and that would contaminate it. Or that it was so cold in the churches, there weren't any pews, there wasn't any heating or air conditioning, and it really was quite cold, and they thought the communion wine might freeze, and that would be not, I would say kosher, but that's the wrong religion. And then the other reason that was said why the common people couldn't have wine at communion is they might think that they were equal to the priests, which of course was the real reason. So Hus was ordered to not serve wine at communion, but he wasn't a very compliant person, and his belief was that the common people should be able to partake of bread and wine, so he kept serving that, kept preaching in the common language. So the archbishop finally had enough, so he went to the church, went to the front of the church and started speaking the writ of excommunication to Jan Hus. Well, what happened then was people in the congregation just picked up the archbishop, still saying that he was going to be excommunicated, carried him out of the building, and just deposited him in the town square. That did not go down very well. So eventually, for his bravery and commitment to his beliefs, he ended up being condemned to be burned at the stake. He was told that he would have safe passage to the Council of Constance, but he was betrayed and then was burned at the stake. And Martin Luther later said that we are all Hussites at heart. So today, in part because of Jan Hus, we claim the chalice as the cup of our common humanity and the flame as the search for truth and meaning. And we have benefited from his commitment to freedom of thought. So as we move forward in history, we come to the life of Michael Servetus, a physician as well as theologian. He was the first person to document the pulmonary respiration in the human body. He was born in Spain somewhere around 1510. So after reading and studying the Bible, Servetus came up with the same belief that Catherine Vogel and many other people did before him, that the Trinity is not biblically based. And so he wrote a book entitled On the Errors of the Trinity. Now, sometime during this period, nobody's really quite sure, he started writing private letters to John Calvin, who founded the Calvinist movement. And Servetus's beliefs were so heretical to Calvin that he said, if you ever come to Geneva, you'll be burned at the stake. Now, if I got that message, I'm not sure I would go to Geneva. However, Servetus was an unusual person and ended up in Geneva, and he ended up being burned at the stake on October the 27th, 1553. However, his death unleashed a heated debate within Protestantism about what should be done with heretics. Now remember, the word heresy only means to doubt, and our history is full of doubters. Our congregation is full of doubters. But the conversation started after his death because he, was burned at the stake, still professing his beliefs, that they should have spared Servetus because to kill a man is not to protect a doctrine. It is just to kill a person. When Servetus fought with reason and writings, he should have been repulsed by reasons and writings. So what were the core beliefs that Servetus died for? That there is no original sin. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? That Jesus had one nature, fully human and fully divine. That all people, regardless of religion, are able to improve themselves, their souls. That grace is available to all people. And that all things are part of God. While his beliefs confirm some of the earliest beliefs about who Jesus was, Servetus's beliefs that all things are part of God also point to our current understanding of the interdependent web of existence. So another person, as we're romping through history, who helped establish Unitarian beliefs or proto-Unitarian beliefs was Socinus, who was born in 1539. And in the years following Hus's death, Socinus's call for reason in religion was not as threatening to the people as it had been earlier in Europe. So there was this period of freedom of thought, but it was still fragile because just a few years later, the Inquisition came to power, and it made Italy unsafe for those who questioned Catholic dogma. So Socinus's uncle, who was a free thinker, went into exile. When he died, Socinus inherited his heretical writings, and then Socinus chose to go into exile rather than suffer burning at the stake or torture. So he moved to Switzerland and then to Transylvania from 1540 to 1571, where Unitarian King John Sigismund had been welcoming free thinkers. When Sigismund died and freedom of thought was repressed again, Socinus moved to Poland, a sanctuary. At that time, it was often called the Heretics' Asylum because of their freedom of thought. So in Krakow, Socinus found a congregation of nonconformists, and they were part of a movement that began in 1565. And UU historian Earl Morse Wilbur considers that the historical beginning of organized Unitarianism. Yet even in that tolerant atmosphere, in Poland, Socinus's beliefs were unorthodox enough that he ended up seeing all of his books burned in the town center because he wouldn't recant his heresies. So throughout these centuries, free thinkers pushed the strictures of religious dogma. Certainly one of those free thinkers was Francis David, whose words we read a couple of Sundays ago. His preaching to Transylvanian King John Sigismund convinced the king to allow the people in his kingdom to believe according to their own conscience and not as the king believed. His signing of the Edict of Torda in 1568 was the first edict of religious tolerance, and that marked a shift to more freedom of thought. Of course, with his death, freedom of thought was repressed once again. But throughout all of this, the Unitarian thread of our faith continued to get a foothold in the hearts and minds of people. Today, we're very aware of the importance of vigilance, the vigilance it takes to uphold the right of free thinking and diversity of religious thought. 2 centuries after our European forebears died, their religious descendants, Jefferson, Franklin, Washington, the Adamses, Benjamin Rush, and others, helped craft the foundational documents of this nation. While the documents were not perfect, they were in that day helped set a different path for this nation than the foundation of other nations. That path was intended to hold as sacred the right of people to determine their own spiritual and religious beliefs. It's a heritage we support. It's a heritage with which we welcome new members into our congregation. After all, our ancestors of faith gave their lives to make it possible for us to profess a free faith.